Picture this. It's March 1555, and a young scholar sits in a cell at Hampton Court Palace. Not a dungeon exactly, but not freedom either. He's been imprisoned for calculating, a word that in Tudor England meant far more than mathematics. It meant astrology. It meant predicting the fates of rulers. It meant attempting to read the future written in the stars. He's been accused of casting horoscopes about Queen Mary, of attempting to divine when she might die so that her half-sister Elizabeth might take the throne. The scholar's name is John Dee. He's in his late 20s, and he's terrified because in 1555, predicting the death of a monarch isn't just impolite, it's treason. And treason carries the most brutal penalty imaginable: execution by hanging, drawing, and quartering, your body displayed as a warning to anyone else who might peer too eagerly into forbidden futures. John Dee will survive this accusation. He will be released. He will be cleared of formal charges. And within a few years, when Elizabeth does take the throne, he will become one of the most unusual figures in her orbit, a scholar consulted for his knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and astrology, a man who will help select an auspicious date for her coronation, a man whose reputation will spread across Europe as one of the great intellects of his age. But he will also become something else, something stranger, something far more dangerous. Because John Dee will eventually claim to speak with angels, and in doing so, he will blur the boundary between scholarship and sorcery so thoroughly that even a queen who valued his knowledge would be forced to keep him at arm's length. Because there are some futures too dangerous to predict, some knowledge too forbidden to seek, and some questions that, once asked, can never be unasked. I'm Danielle Christmas, and this is Forbidden Predictions. Before we can understand how John Dee became the Queen's conjurer, we need to understand who he was before the angels, or whatever they were, began speaking. John Dee was born in July 1527 in the London neighborhood known as Tower Ward. His father, Rowland Dee, served as a gentleman's server at the court of Henry VIII, not a nobleman, but a respectable court official, the kind of position that offered stability, connections, and the means to educate a gifted child. And John Dee was very gifted. At 15, he entered St. John's College at Cambridge University. By 18, he had earned his Bachelor of Arts. But it was what happened next that revealed the scope of his ambition. In 1546, Dee became one of the founding fellows of Trinity College, Cambridge. He was only 19 years old, a remarkable achievement even in an era that valued precocious scholarship. And he did not confine himself to the standard curriculum. He studied mathematics obsessively, astronomy, geometry, navigation, what we might now call the mathematical sciences. These fields were not considered separate from philosophy or theology. They were seen as pathways to understanding the structure of God's creation itself. There's a famous story from this period, one that captures how early Dee's reputation for strange brilliance began. During a theatrical performance of Aristophanes' piece, Dee designed elaborate mechanical stage effects, devices that made scenery shift, figures move, and fantastical elements appear to fly. The technology was so sophisticated that audiences reportedly suspected supernatural involvement. Even then, whispers followed him. To understand why, you have to understand something about the 16th century. The line between science and magic was not where we place it today. Astronomy and astrology were still closely intertwined disciplines. Mathematics itself was seen as a sacred language, a tool for understanding divine order. A scholar who could predict an eclipse was not merely a technician. He was someone capable of reading the heavens. And reading the heavens meant, potentially, understanding God's will. Dee embraced this worldview fully. In 1547, he left England to study on the continent, traveling to the University of Louvain in the Low Countries, one of the great intellectual centers of Europe. There he studied under the renowned mathematician and instrument maker Gemma Frisius. He met Gerardus Mercator, whose cartographic innovations would later transform navigation. He lectured publicly on Euclid's geometry, drawing crowds eager to witness his demonstrations. His reputation grew rapidly. By his early 20s, he was already known among Europe's mathematical elite. When he returned to England in 1551, he was 24 years old and already respected as a serious scholar, someone whose knowledge of mathematics and navigation could serve the ambitions of an emerging maritime nation. But he was also becoming interested in something else, something more dangerous. John Dee became fascinated by what scholars of the time called natural magic. This was not witchcraft, at least not as he understood it. Natural magic referred to the belief that hidden forces existed within nature, forces that could be studied, understood, and harnessed through knowledge, not through demonic pacts, but through disciplined inquiry. To Dee, this pursuit was deeply religious. He believed that studying nature was a way of studying God's design. And so he began collecting books, thousands of them. His library at Mortlake, his home on the Thames, would eventually grow to more than 4,000 volumes, one of the largest private libraries in England. Works on mathematics and astronomy sat beside texts on alchemy, astrology, Hermetic philosophy, and Kabbalistic mysticism. To Dee, these subjects were not contradictions. They were parts of a single unified search for truth. To others, they looked increasingly suspicious, and that suspicion would eventually place him in that Hampton Court cell in 1555, accused of using astrology to predict the fate of a queen. He survived the accusation, but the reputation lingered. John Dee was brilliant, undeniably so, but he was also unusual, curious about things that many believed should remain unknown. And in November 1558, everything changed. Queen Mary died, and her half-sister Elizabeth became Queen of England. Elizabeth did not make John Dee a formal minister or political advisor, but she did consult him, particularly when specialized knowledge was required. And one of the first questions she brought to him was deceptively simple. When should she be crowned? In the 16th century, timing was never merely practical. It was symbolic. Astrological calculations were commonly used to determine auspicious moments for major events, especially those involving monarchy. The alignment of planets, the phase of the moon, the positioning of celestial bodies within the zodiac, all were believed to influence fortune and destiny. So Dee did what he did best. He calculated. Using astronomical tables and astrological charts, he determined a favorable date, January 15th, 1559. On that day, Elizabeth I was crowned Queen of England. Whether the stars truly shaped her reign is a matter of belief, but her rule would last 44 years, one of the longest and most stable reigns in English history, and John Dee's reputation grew alongside it. Though he never held a permanent official post, Dee remained a figure of occasional importance at court. He advised on navigation and geography, contributing ideas that supported England's emerging maritime ambitions. He wrote treatises that helped explorers better understand mapping, measurement, and long-distance travel. He was also among the first writers to use the phrase British Empire, a term that, at the time, reflected an emerging vision of England as a seafaring power with ambitions beyond its shores. But for all his legitimate scholarship, Dee was searching for something beyond conventional knowledge, something books alone could not provide. Because knowledge for Dee always seemed to end at the same barrier. You could read every manuscript in existence, study every diagram, solve every mathematical equation, and still the deepest mysteries remained unanswered. What was the structure of heaven? How did angels communicate? What language had been spoken before the fall of Adam, before human speech became divided? Dee became convinced that there must be a way to access divine knowledge directly, not through speculation, not through observation, but through communication. He believed that angels, if properly approached, might reveal truths beyond the reach of ordinary scholarship. At first, he attempted this alone. In 1581, he began experimenting with scrying, the practice of gazing into reflective surfaces in hopes of receiving visions. He used polished crystals, reflective stones, and eventually an obsidian mirror, likely originating from the Aztec world, brought to Europe after the Spanish conquests. He would sit in his study at Mortlake, surrounded by shelves of books, staring into reflective surfaces for hours at a time. Waiting, watching, hoping, but nothing clear appeared, or at least nothing he trusted. Dee was a meticulous thinker. He valued clarity and certainty. Vague impressions were not enough. He needed someone who could see more clearly than he could, someone who claimed to possess a gift he lacked. And in March 1582, that person arrived. Edward Kelley was not, by most accounts, a respectable man. Born Edward Talbot, likely in 1555, he adopted the name Kelley later in life, perhaps to distance himself from earlier accusations or to craft a new identity. Stories circulated about his past. One persistent claim held that he had been convicted of forgery and punished by having his ears cropped, a visible mark of criminal disgrace. Whether this detail is entirely accurate remains debated, but contemporaries widely believed it, and Kelley was known for wearing a cap that concealed his ears. Whatever the truth, Kelley arrived with extraordinary claims. He said he could see visions and crystals. He said he could communicate with angels. And John Dee, who had spent years seeking precisely that ability, was willing to listen. Their first recorded session took place on March 8, 1582. Dee documented the event meticulously in what would later be known as his spiritual diaries, records that still survive today, filled with diagrams, conversations, and careful observations. Kelley sat before the crystal, and almost immediately he began describing what he claimed to see. An angel, he said, an angel named Uriel. According to Kelley, the angel was not merely visible, but communicative, delivering messages in unfamiliar sounds and symbolic patterns. Dee, seated nearby with pen in hand, recorded every word, asking questions, seeking clarification, treating the session not as superstition, but as an experiment. The message Kelley delivered that day would shape the rest of Dee's life. The angel, Kelley claimed, said that Dee had been chosen, that he would receive divine knowledge, secrets hidden since the earliest days of creation, that he would learn the language spoken before the fall of Adam, a sacred tongue believed to hold the structure of reality itself. This was everything Dee had been searching for: direct revelation, knowledge unmediated by books, truth delivered from beyond the limits of human scholarship. He was captivated, and from that moment forward, there was no turning back. Let me describe what a typical scrying session looked like, based on Dee's own meticulous records. The setting was usually his study at Mortlake, though later sessions would take place in the homes of patrons across England and continental Europe. Dee approached these sessions with deliberate care. The space was prepared intentionally, sometimes with specific objects placed in deliberate patterns, sometimes with protective symbols drawn or inscribed. This was not casual fortune-telling. This was ritualized inquiry, structured, methodical, and, in Dee's mind, disciplined. At the center of the room stood the showstone, the object through which visions were expected to appear. Sometimes this was a polished crystal sphere, sometimes it was a reflective stone, and sometimes it was his obsidian mirror. These objects were not decorative curiosities. They were instruments. Kelley would sit before the showstone, often at a specially constructed table. This was not an ordinary table. It was what Dee described as a table of practice, a surface inscribed with symbolic diagrams, sacred names, and geometric figures believed to offer protection and structure to the ritual. Several of Dee's surviving magical instruments, including crystal stones, diagrams, and ritual materials, remain preserved today in British Museum collections, offering rare physical evidence of these practices. This session would begin with a prayer. long, deliberate prayers in Latin or occasionally Hebrew, invocations asking for divine guidance, protection, and clarity. Dee did not believe he was summoning demons. He believed he was petitioning heaven itself. In his mind, this work was devotional, scholarly, sacred. Then Kelley would begin to gaze. Sometimes the crystal remained silent for long stretches of time. Minutes could pass, sometimes hours. Kelley would describe flashes of light, shifting shapes, colors forming and dissolving. Eventually, according to his reports, figures would emerge. Angels. Or beings he interpreted as angels. Some appeared in recognizable forms, radiant human-like figures. Others were described as geometric structures, radiant patterns, or shapes difficult to translate into ordinary language. And then, Kelley said, they spoke. Kelley would relay what he claimed to hear. Dee would write every word. Sometimes the messages appeared in English, sometimes Latin. Increasingly, however, they emerged in a constructed language that Dee came to believe was sacred, the language of angels themselves. Today, scholars refer to it as Enochian. Dee recorded symbols, alphabets, and structured tables, vast grids of letters arranged in complex patterns. He believed these represented divine systems governing the structure of the cosmos. This was not improvisation. This was documentation, systematic, repetitive, extensive. Dee approached these sessions the same way he approached mathematics, as a discipline requiring precision and patience. And sometimes the instructions delivered during these sessions became deeply unsettling. In 1587, Kelley reported that the angels issued a command that tested the limits of Dee's belief. They were told that spiritual progress required absolute trust and the abandonment of earthly attachments, including, according to the reported message, the boundaries of marriage. The angels instructed Dee and Kelley to share their wives. Dee recorded this moment in his diaries with visible distress. He struggled deeply with the instruction. Eventually, he wrote that he consented to the command, but whether the exchange was ever physically carried out remains uncertain. Historians continue to debate the details. What is clear is that the episode created tension between Dee and Kelley, tension that would linger long after the moment passed. Despite growing strain, the work continued. More tables, more symbols, more invocations, hundreds of pages of records filled with diagrams, phonetic transcriptions, and ritual instructions. To Dee, this was not madness, it was revelation. And yet, outside his study walls, the world was growing increasingly suspicious. There was always a risk in claiming to speak with angels in Elizabethan England. Religious conflict defined the century. England had broken from Rome under Henry VIII, returned briefly to Catholicism under Mary I, and then re-established Protestant rule under Elizabeth. The boundaries between acceptable devotion, dangerous heresy, and criminal witchcraft were unstable and often politically charged. John Dee's work existed dangerously close to all three. At first, his connections offered protection. Elizabeth valued knowledge, especially knowledge that strengthened England's maritime ambitions. Dee's expertise in mathematics and navigation made him useful. His ideas supported exploration, mapping, and long-distance travel. But usefulness did not guarantee safety. Elizabeth maintained distance. Dee remained a consultant, not an official minister. His proximity to power was real, but always cautious, because association with occult practices carried risks not only for the practitioner, but for the crown itself. Suspicion grew strongest in Dee's own neighborhood. Residents near his home at Mortlake observed unusual activity: late-night lights, unfamiliar visitors, strange objects carried in and out of his house. Rumors spread that he was practicing forbidden arts. In 1583, while Dee was traveling abroad, his house was attacked. It was not burned to the ground, but it was ransacked. Books were stolen, instruments damaged, manuscripts destroyed or scattered. The loss was devastating. Thousands of volumes, many irreplaceable, were lost through theft or damage during this period. For a scholar whose life centered on knowledge, the destruction of his library was catastrophic. At the same time, pressures mounted from political and religious authorities. Advisors within Elizabeth's government expressed concerns about Dee's reputation. Some feared that his practices might attract unwanted scrutiny from Catholic powers abroad. Others worried that his angelic claims bordered too closely on forbidden forms of conjuring. There were whispers, quiet but persistent, that Dee was reckless, that he was dangerous, that he might be deceiving patrons, or worse, inviting forces beyond his control. No formal charges were brought, but the atmosphere was shifting, and Dee recognized the danger. In September 1583, he accepted an invitation that would remove him from England entirely. A Polish nobleman, Count Albert Lasky, offered patronage, protection, and the opportunity to continue his work abroad. For Dee, the offer promised safety. It also promised freedom. He accepted. Dee, Kelley, and their families departed England. They would remain on the continent for several years, traveling through Poland, Bohemia, and other regions of Central Europe in search of patrons willing to support their work. At first, the journey felt promising, but the future waiting for them was far less stable than they imagined. During their years abroad, Dee and Kelley moved between courts and noble households, presenting themselves as bearers of rare knowledge. They performed scrying sessions, they described angelic visions, they offered alchemical insight, particularly the possibility of transforming base metals into gold, a promise that fascinated rulers across Europe. In the mid-1580s, they traveled to Prague, then the capital of the Holy Roman Empire under Emperor Rudolf II. Rudolf was known for his interest in astrology, alchemy, and esoteric scholarship. His court attracted mystics, scholars, and experimenters from across Europe. It seemed like the perfect environment for Dee's ambitions, but expectations ran high. Too high. The problem was simple. Promises were easier to make than results. Angel messages accumulated, but produced no clear proof. Alchemical claims inspired curiosity, but yielded no gold. Patrons grew impatient, and religious authorities took notice. In 1586, pressure mounted from Catholic officials concerned about reports of spirit communication and unauthorized ritual practices. Dee and Kelley were urged to leave imperial territory. They continued moving between regions, eventually settling for a time under the patronage of the Bohemian nobleman Wilhelm Rosenberg. But by this point, tensions between Dee and Kelley had grown severe. The earlier conflict involving their wives had created lasting mistrust. Kelley increasingly asserted independence, recognizing that his claimed abilities made him valuable to patrons without Dee's mediation. Their partnership fractured. In 1589, they separated. It was not a reconciliation. It was a rupture. Kelley remained on the continent, continuing to promise alchemical success to noble patrons. Eventually, after repeated failures to produce the promised gold, he was imprisoned by imperial authorities. Accounts differ regarding the precise circumstances, but it appears he remained confined for several years. He died around 1597 or 98, possibly from injuries sustained while attempting to escape confinement. His final years remained shadowed by uncertainty. John Dee, meanwhile, returned to England in December 1589. He was 62 years old, and the world he returned to had changed. His house at Mortlake bore the marks of earlier destruction. Books were missing, instruments gone, years of intellectual labor scattered or lost. Elizabeth still remembered him. She provided occasional assistance, small grants, modest support, but she did not restore him to prominence. Political caution had hardened. Public suspicion lingered. Dee sought employment wherever he could find it. In 1595, he was appointed warden of Christ's College in Manchester, a position that provided income but removed him from London's intellectual center. For a man once consulted at court, the appointment felt like distance, perhaps even quiet exile. His final years were marked by decline. Financial hardship worsened. His wife Jane died in 1605. His remaining possessions were gradually sold to support his household. He continued to study his angelic records, continued to believe, continued to hope that one day someone would understand the magnitude of what he believed he had discovered. When Elizabeth died in 1603, Dee lost his most powerful protector. Her successor, James I, viewed claims of spirit communication with deep suspicion. He had written extensively on witchcraft and the dangers of supernatural deception. John Dee's work found no welcome there. He died in late 1608 or early 1609. The exact date was not carefully recorded, a quiet ending for a man once known across Europe. He was buried at Mortlake, without ceremony, without monument, without recognition equal to the scale of his ambition. And yet, John Dee's story did not end with his death, because the records he left behind survived. Not intact, not undamaged, but preserved. In the late 19th century, scholars and occultists rediscovered Dee's manuscripts. Among them were members of a secret magical society known as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. They studied his diagrams, his alphabets, his structured systems of invocation. They believed they had uncovered a complete magical language, a system capable of opening symbolic pathways to spiritual insight. Through the Golden Dawn, Dee's work influenced later occult figures, including Aleister Crowley, who incorporated elements of the Enochian system into his own ritual practices. Over time, these ideas spread across esoteric traditions, adapted, modified, reinterpreted. Today, books on Enochian magic can be found in occult bookstores around the world. Study groups analyze Dee's symbols. Practitioners experiment with the same calls and invocations first recorded in the 1580s. The system he documented, whether divinely inspired, psychologically constructed, or carefully performed, endured long after his reputation faded. Several of Dee's ritual tools and artifacts survive today in museum collections across Britain. Crystal stones, obsidian mirrors, inscribed diagrams, objects that once sat on wooden tables in candlelit rooms while two men attempted to listen for voices from beyond the visible world. Physical remnants of extraordinary belief. Whether the angels were real, whether Kelley believed what he claimed, whether Dee was visionary, deceived, or something in between, those questions remain unanswered. But the record remains. Pages filled with symbols, voices captured in ink, a scholar reaching beyond the limits of ordinary knowledge, and perhaps discovering something he never fully understood. There is one final detail about John Dee that rarely appears in the official records. Not about angels, not about kings, not about forbidden knowledge, but about what remained of him after everything else was gone. John Dee was buried in Mortlake in the parish church of St. Mary the Virgin. There was no grand monument, no marble effigy, no royal inscription. Just a grave, quiet, modest, nearly anonymous. For a time, his resting place was known. Parish records noted the burial, locals remembered where he lay. But as the years passed, memory faded. The church itself changed. Repairs were made, floors were replaced, walls rebuilt. Generations came and went. And somewhere along the way, no one can say exactly when, the precise location of John Dee's grave was lost. Not destroyed, not deliberately erased, simply forgotten. Today, visitors can still stand in that church. They can walk across the stone floor where Dee was once laid to rest. They can look toward the altar, they can listen to the quiet echo of footsteps beneath the vaulted ceiling. But they cannot point to the place where his body lies, because no one knows where it is. The man who tried to map the heavens, who charted the movements of stars, who believed he had recorded the language of angels, was ultimately returned to the earth without coordinates, without markers, without certainty. And perhaps that is the final irony of John Dee's life. He spent decades searching for hidden knowledge, seeking messages from realms beyond human sight. But in the end, the only mystery left unsolved was where he himself had gone. Forbidden Predictions is written and hosted by me, Danielle Christmas, and produced by Audio Ellis. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and comment. Until next time, remember, the future is always uncertain, but the past is full of people who were punished for trying to see what came next. Thanks for listening.